What happens when a respected elderly man is unfairly treated at his bank only for his daughter, an influential executive, to step in and reveal a hidden bias? Watch as Edward and Samantha Bennett confront injustice head-on. Please comment where you're watching from so others can join in and enjoy the story. The automatic doors at Hillstone Federal Bank opened with a soft hiss, letting in the late morning sun. 73-year-old Edward Bennett stepped into the lobby, his cane tapping steadily against the tile floor. He wasn't frail, but the cane gave him a sense of stability. His suit was sharply pressed, his silver hair neatly combed, and he carried himself with the quiet dignity of someone accustomed to respect. Edward had been a loyal customer at this branch for nearly 2 decades. He preferred coming in mid-morning after a quiet breakfast at his favorite diner. But something felt different today. As he approached the counter, he noticed the young woman behind it barely glanced at him. No smile, no greeting, just a quick look. Then her attention turned elsewhere. Edward tried to brush it off. Perhaps she was new, or the bank was short-staffed. He stood behind a man in a baseball cap who appeared to be in a hurry. After a few minutes, it was Edward's turn. The young teller gave a nervous glance behind her, then slipped into a back room without saying a word. Edward stood quietly still, holding his check and ID, waiting for someone to help him. A few moments later, a tall woman approached the counter. She wore a pale gray blazer, and her sharp blue eyes seemed to measure him instead of seeing him. Her name tag read, Rebecca Davis, Branch Manager. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked, her voice cold as she folded her arms. Edward smiled politely, lifting the check slightly. "I'd like to deposit this into my savings." Rebecca looked at the check, then back at him. "May I see your ID?" "Of course," Edward replied, handing her his driver's license along with the check. The check was from a retirement account payout, nothing out of the ordinary. Rebecca studied the ID for an uncomfortably long moment, her eyes scanning it as though she were searching for something suspicious. Then she glanced back at the check. "And how did you come into possession of this check?" Edward blinked, confused. "I'm sorry. It's a large check," Rebecca explained, her tone almost dismissive. "We need to verify these things before processing them. We've had issues with fraud." Edward felt a flicker of irritation. "I've deposited checks of similar amounts here for years. There's never been an issue." Rebecca gave a tight smile, her lips barely moving. "Banking policies have changed, sir. I'm sure you understand." Edward took a slow breath, trying to remain calm. "I've been a customer here for nearly 20 years. My account, my ID, everything is in order." Still, Rebecca didn't relent. "We need to verify the check further. You'll have to come with me to the back." Edward's chest tightened, not out of fear but out of frustration. He wasn't just a random customer. He was a long-standing client respected here for years. He didn't deserve to be treated like this. "I'd prefer to stay here," Edward said firmly. Rebecca leaned in slightly. "Sir, if you don't cooperate, we'll place a hold on the funds and report it as potential fraud." Edward didn't flinch. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket, pulling out his phone with deliberate slowness. As the screen lit up, Rebecca's eyes narrowed. He raised the phone to his ear. "Hello, baby," Edward said, his voice even. "I'm at the bank on Meridian. They're having trouble verifying my check." "Yes, her name is Rebecca, the branch manager." Rebecca's jaw clenched, but she didn't interrupt. "I'm fine, just tired." "Yes, I'll wait here." Edward continued, then ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket. He turned back to Rebecca. "My daughter is on her way. She'll help sort this out." Rebecca crossed her arms. "Sir, raising your voice or causing a disturbance can be grounds for removal." Edward's eyes met hers. "Do I look like I'm causing a disturbance?" Rebecca briefly looked away, clearly flustered. I have a responsibility to protect this institution. If we don't verify properly, it puts the bank at risk. You think I'm a risk? Edward asked, his voice calm but firm. Rebecca hesitated but didn't respond. The room was still now, all eyes subtly on the interaction, the tension thick. Edward didn't raise his voice or make a scene. He simply stood there waiting for his daughter to arrive and make things right. Edward stood calmly at the counter, his eyes fixed on Rebecca as the tension in the room grew. He didn't have to raise his voice. He didn't need to argue. He simply waited, knowing that the arrival of his daughter Samantha Bennett would make all the difference. Rebecca, on the other hand, was visibly uncomfortable. She kept glancing at her computer, then back at Edward, her lips pressed tightly together. The silence in the bank felt suffocating. No one seemed to know what to do next. A few minutes passed before the doors to the bank slid open again, and the soft jingle of the doorbell seemed to signal the arrival of someone important. Edward's face remained impassive, but his heart gave a slight flutter of relief. Samantha had arrived. Samantha Bennett. Edward's only daughter walked into the bank with the same confidence that Edward had always admired. Her long, dark hair framed her sharp features, and she wore a tailored navy suit that radiated authority. She didn't scan the room or hesitate. She walked straight to the counter, where Edward stood, her eyes narrowing as she saw the situation before her. "Hi, Dad," Samantha said, giving him a warm smile before turning her gaze to Rebecca, whose discomfort was now palpable. "Is there a problem here?" Rebecca, now slightly flustered, straightened her posture but didn't respond immediately. Instead, she gave Edward one last look as if weighing her options. But when she turned to face Samantha, the change was immediate. There was a brief flicker of recognition in her eyes, followed by a moment of hesitation. Samantha wasted no time. "I'm Samantha Bennett. This is my father. I'm also on the executive board of this bank. What's the issue?" Rebecca's jaw tightened. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words didn't come immediately. Edward could see that she had not expected Samantha's arrival, and she had certainly not expected to be confronted by someone with the authority Samantha carried. "Well," Rebecca began, trying to compose herself, "there's a problem with the check he's trying to deposit. It's a large amount, and we need to verify it further." Samantha raised an eyebrow. "I see. You need to verify the check. Let's clarify something. My father has been a customer here for almost 2 decades. His ID is valid. The check is legitimate, and you've had no issues with similar deposits in the past." Rebecca opened her mouth to argue, but Samantha held up a hand, her tone sharp but controlled. "But here's what I don't understand. Why did you treat my father differently? Why is he being subjected to additional scrutiny, when clearly no other customer would have been?" Samantha's voice was steady, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. Edward couldn't help but feel a sense of pride as he watched his daughter take control of the situation. He knew she had always been strong, but to see her stand up for him in this way, in front of a room full of witnesses, was both humbling and comforting. Rebecca's face flushed as she realized she had no real answer. She had been caught off guard by Samantha's assertiveness, and the weight of her actions seemed to settle on her shoulders. She opened her mouth again, but no words came out. Samantha took a step closer, her eyes not leaving Rebecca's. "Let's be clear, Rebecca. I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here because my father is a respected customer, and he deserves to be treated with dignity, not suspicion. I want you to process this check, and I want an explanation as to why it was delayed in the first place." The other tellers, who had been silently observing the exchange, shifted uncomfortably. A few customers glanced up from their paperwork, noticing the tension. Edward could sense their eyes on him, but he didn't flinch. He had fought battles like this before quietly, without making a scene. Rebecca stood frozen for a long moment, unable to meet Samantha's gaze. Edward could see that her entire demeanor had shifted. She had gone from confident, even smug, to suddenly unsure of herself. The power dynamic in the room had shifted completely. Finally, after a long pause, Rebecca mumbled, "I'll process the deposit now. I'm sorry for the inconvenience." Samantha's voice remained even. "Thank you." Edward didn't say a word, but his pride in his daughter was palpable. As Rebecca quickly processed the check and handed over the receipt, Samantha turned to her father, offering a small, reassuring smile. "Thanks for handling that," Edward said quietly, his voice steady. Samantha nodded, her expression softening. "Don't worry about it, Dad. You don't have to deal with this kind of thing." They stood for a moment in silence, the weight of the past few minutes settling in. It wasn't just about the check. It was about something far deeper, the way people sometimes make assumptions about others based on nothing but their appearance. Edward knew that this moment would stay with him, but he also knew that having Samantha by his side made all the difference. The moment Samantha Bennett walked into the bank, everything shifted. Edward's calm, collected demeanor hadn't wavered, but there was a noticeable tension in the air that seemed to dissolve as soon as Samantha entered. She walked toward the counter with purpose, her confident stride drawing everyone's attention, including Rebecca's. Samantha's eyes scanned the room quickly before they locked on Edward, who stood silently with his arms folded. He gave her a faint smile, a look of gratitude mixed with a quiet pride. Samantha didn't waste any time. She approached the counter, standing beside her father. Rebecca, still visibly rattled from her earlier interactions with Edward, straightened her posture as Samantha addressed her directly. "Rebecca," Samantha said, her voice sharp and steady, "is there a problem with my father's account?" Rebecca hesitated for a moment before speaking, but her unease was clear. No problem," she stammered. "It's just that the check he's trying to deposit is for a significant amount, and we need to verify it." Samantha raised an eyebrow. "A significant amount? My father has been banking here for almost 2 decades. His identity is verified. His check is legitimate. Why is this even an issue?" Rebecca faltered. The words that had come so easily when addressing Edward now caught in her throat. She quickly glanced down at her computer screen, trying to regain composure, but the tension in the room was palpable. Samantha didn't give her a chance to explain. "You questioned him, not because of any policy, but because of who he is, because of the way he looks. And you treated him like a criminal in front of other customers. That's not how we do things here." Edward felt the heat rise in his chest as he stood there still holding his receipt. He wanted to say something to make Rebecca understand what she had done, but Samantha had taken charge. She was speaking for both of them now, and that gave him a sense of relief. Rebecca swallowed hard, her face flushing. She clearly wasn't used to being confronted, certainly not by someone with as much authority as Samantha. The bank's manager opened her mouth to respond, but hesitated. Samantha's voice remained unwavering. "You've embarrassed my father, Rebecca. And frankly, it's hard to believe this is just a policy issue. I'm not interested in excuses. I'm interested in accountability." Rebecca's jaw tightened, but she still didn't respond. She had no words to defend herself. Behind the counter, the other tellers were frozen, watching the exchange unfold. Some of the customers in the lobby were now fully aware of what was happening, their eyes darting between Samantha Edward and Rebecca. Edward could sense the unspoken judgment from the other patrons. They all knew what had been happening, knew the uncomfortable truth that Rebecca had not been treating him like a valued customer. "Look," Samantha continued, her voice more measured now. "I'm not here to escalate things, but I am here to make sure this doesn't happen again. My father deserves respect. Every customer deserves respect." Rebecca finally met her eyes, her shoulders slumped in defeat. "I understand," she murmured, though the words felt hollow. She couldn't meet Samantha's gaze for long, her discomfort written all over her face. "I'll process the deposit now." Samantha gave a nod, her eyes still fixed on Rebecca. "Please do." The manager quickly turned to the computer, processing the check with mechanical speed. Her hands shook slightly as she typed in the numbers, but there was no hesitation now, only the quiet acknowledgement that the power in the room had shifted. Edward couldn't help but notice the silence that had descended upon the room. It wasn't oppressive or uncomfortable anymore, it was simply quiet. The customers had stopped pretending to be busy, and the staff had stopped pretending to work. They were all watching, witnessing the shift that had just occurred. Finally, Rebecca handed the receipt to Edward. "Your deposit is processed," she said quietly, her voice strained. Edward nodded, taking the receipt from her. He didn't thank her. He didn't need to. This wasn't about politeness anymore. It was about respect, and he knew his daughter had made sure that was clear. Samantha turned to her father, her expression softening for a moment. "You okay?" she asked, her voice gentle. Edward smiled faintly. "I'm fine, sweetheart." Samantha placed a hand on his shoulder before turning back to Rebecca. "I'd suggest you take a long, hard look at your policies. The kind of scrutiny you placed on my father today isn't just inappropriate, it's unfair. I hope you'll consider how you treat all customers moving forward." Rebecca gave a quick nod, but her face remained pale. She knew the conversation wasn't over, not by a long shot. The damage had been done, and she would have to answer for it. As Edward and Samantha made their way to the door, the silence in the bank lingered for a few more moments. The lesson wasn't just about banking policies, it was about recognizing the humanity in everyone who walked through the door. As Edward and Samantha stepped out of Hillstone Federal Bank, the weight of the situation lingered. They didn't speak immediately, each of them lost in their own thoughts as they walked toward the car. The morning sun was still high, casting long shadows on the sidewalk, but the air between them was charged with the silent acknowledgement that something important had just happened. In the bank, the staff had returned to their tasks, but the atmosphere had shifted. Rebecca, still flustered from the confrontation, sat at her desk, her hands trembling as she typed. It wasn't just about the check anymore. It was about the look on Edward's face, the way Samantha had made her see things she hadn't wanted to acknowledge. A few moments after Edward and Samantha had left the senior associate, a man named David Thomas walked over to Rebecca's desk. He had witnessed the exchange from the other side of the room, and now his expression was one of quiet concern. "Rebecca," David said gently, "are you okay?" Rebecca didn't look up immediately. She kept her eyes trained on the computer screen, her fingers still hovering over the keyboard. "I don't know what happened," she muttered. "It was just a check." David waited for her to continue, but when it became clear she wasn't going to, he spoke again. "You're not used to being challenged, are you?" She finally glanced up, meeting his gaze. There was a flicker of embarrassment in her eyes, but it quickly faded as she forced herself to sit straighter. "I was just following procedure. That's all." David nodded slowly, understanding her frustration, but not completely agreeing. "It wasn't about the procedure, Rebecca. It was about how you treated him. You know as well as I do that it's not just the bank's rules that matter. It's how we treat the people who come in here." Rebecca sighed heavily, her shoulders slumping. "I didn't mean to. It's just that he was—" She stopped herself, not wanting to say the words aloud. David's face softened as he saw where the conversation was going. "You can't treat people that way, not in 2025, and especially not when they've been loyal customers for years. We don't know what's going on in their lives or what they've been through." Rebecca looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting together nervously. "I didn't think about it like that. I didn't think about him at all, really. I was just doing my job." David took a breath, leaning slightly forward. You didn't just do your job, Rebecca. You made an assumption about someone based on their appearance. You questioned his character, his integrity, simply because of how he looked. And that's not how we're supposed to operate. Not here. Not anywhere. Rebecca's face flushed, the weight of David's words sinking in. She wanted to argue, to explain herself, but she couldn't. She knew he was right. Meanwhile, outside, Samantha and Edward had made their way to the car, the hum of city traffic, a steady background noise to their conversation. Edward remained quiet, letting Samantha lead the way. He had been through so much in his life, so many moments of quiet humiliation, of people treating him as less than they should. But with Samantha by his side, it didn't hurt as much. She was his shield, his defender, and it was a role she played effortlessly. Samantha opened the car door and turned to her father before getting in. "I'm proud of you, Dad," she said, her voice soft. "You didn't let her get away with it. You made sure she understood that respect is not optional." Edward smiled faintly, his eyes tired but steady. "I'm not sure I did anything extraordinary. I just stood there and waited." Samantha chuckled, slipping into the driver's seat. "No, you didn't just wait. You made her uncomfortable, made her face what she was doing. And that's the most important thing. People need to see what's happening, especially when they think no one is watching." Edward looked out the window, his hands folded in his lap. "I don't know how I feel about this, Sam. I don't like that it happened. I don't like that I had to be treated like that just to get my own money. But I'm glad you were there." Samantha reached over and squeezed his hand gently. "I'll always be here, Dad. You don't have to face anything alone." Back at Hillstone Federal, the fallout was just beginning. David spoke to a few of the tellers who had been present during the incident, urging them to be more mindful in their interactions with customers. He didn't know what would come of Rebecca's behavior, but he could already see the cracks forming in the foundation of her confidence. The senior associate's mind was made up a lesson needed to be learned, not just for Rebecca, but for the whole branch. The following week, Edward returned to Hillstone Federal Bank, stepping into the familiar lobby with the same slow, deliberate pace. He didn't need the cane as much these days, but he still liked the stability it gave him. The soft tap of the cane echoed through the room, and the employees at the counter instantly straightened up. A noticeable shift had occurred. The previous tension was gone, replaced with a quiet reverence. Edward felt it the moment he entered. He wasn't just a customer now, he was someone who had been seen, heard, and respected. The young teller from the previous visit greeted him this time with a warm smile. "Good morning, Mr. Bennett. How can I help you today?" Edward nodded, his face softening. "I'd like to make a withdrawal, please." The teller nodded quickly, a nervous look in her eyes as she led him to the counter. As they walked, Edward couldn't help but notice the new posters that had been put up on the walls, each one bearing the words, "Respect is standard." The faces of various customers were displayed in the posters, some familiar, some not, but all with the same tagline, "We see you, we serve you, we respect you." Edward was quiet for a moment, taking in the changes. There was a new interim manager, Denise Alvarez, who approached him from behind the desk, her expression friendly and genuine. She was different from Rebecca. Her approach wasn't transactional, it was human. "Mr. Bennett," Denise said, with a slight bow of her head, "we're so glad to see you back. I've heard so much about your visit last week, and I wanted to personally thank you for bringing the issue to light." Edward smiled faintly. "I didn't do it to make a point. I just wanted to make sure nobody else had to feel the way I did." Denise nodded. "It's never easy to stand up, especially when it's uncomfortable. But we're making changes, and I want you to know that your experience is a catalyst for something better. We're implementing new sensitivity training for all our employees, and we'll be holding listening sessions with longtime customers like yourself to ensure this never happens again." Edward raised an eyebrow. "That's a good start, but I'll need to see it in action." Denise nodded firmly. "You will, Mr. Bennett. We'll follow through. I promise." After making his withdrawal, Edward walked slowly toward the door. As he reached for the handle, Denise stopped him. "I wanted to ask," she said, "would you consider speaking at a community meeting we're holding next month? It's a listening session, and we'd love for you to share your story." Edward paused, his hand resting on the door. He glanced back at her, then over to the posters on the wall, where faces of the community looked back at him, people just like him, and yet so different. It wasn't just about banking, it was about something bigger. "I'll come," Edward said, his voice steady. "But I won't sugarcoat it. I'll tell it exactly how it happened." Denise smiled softly. "That's exactly what we need." A few weeks later, the community meeting took place in a modest civic center just off Lancaster Avenue. No press, no red carpet, just folding chairs, a podium, and a hand-painted sign that read, "Listening Circle, Hillstone Federal Bank." It was simple, but the room was full of people who had gathered to share their stories to be heard. Edward arrived in his usual attire, a cobalt blue blouse that complemented the silver in his hair. He wasn't flashy, didn't need to be. He wore the same pearl earrings his daughter had gifted him for his granddaughter's graduation, a token of love and continuity. When Edward stepped into the room, the conversation softened. People looked up, nodding in quiet recognition. He made his way to the podium, but instead of standing directly behind it, he chose to stand just beside it, far enough to be heard close enough to make eye contact with everyone in the room. "Good evening," he said, his voice calm but strong. "I'm Edward Bennett, a retired school teacher. I've lived in this community for more than 40 years, and I've been a customer of Hillstone Federal for nearly 15. A few heads nodded, recognizing him. "I'm here today, not just to share my story, but to share a message. Last week I came to this bank to deposit a check just like I've done many times before. But this time was different. This time I was treated as though I didn't belong here simply because of how I looked." Edward paused, letting his words sink in. "I wasn't angry at first. I was hurt, because I knew I hadn't done anything wrong. But I was still treated like I was guilty of something. And that's something that shouldn't happen to anyone." The room was quiet now, save for the occasional sound of a notebook being written in. Edward's voice didn't rise, but it carried weight, like a slow tide rolling in. Silence is often what people count on when they treat others poorly. They count on our politeness, our exhaustion, our desire to avoid conflict. But sometimes the most respectful thing you can do is to speak up. Not for revenge, but for change. He glanced at his daughter sitting near the back of the room, her eyes filled with quiet pride. "I'm not here to destroy anyone's career. I'm here to ask for something better for everyone. For the next person who walks into this bank just like I did, expecting nothing more than respect." Edward's words hung in the air, and for the first time the room felt truly still. People weren't just listening, they were reflecting. After the meeting, a few people approached him to share their own stories. It wasn't just about what had happened to him. It was about what they had all been through. That night, as Edward and Samantha sat together at a quiet booth in their favorite diner, they both knew that the conversation was far from over. But they also knew that something had shifted, something important, not just in the bank, but in the community. The truth had been spoken, and that was a start. "Thank you for speaking up, Dad," Samantha said quietly, squeezing his hand. "They'll remember that." Edward smiled, his heart lighter than it had been in days. "I didn't do it to be remembered," he replied. "I did it so they'd remember each other."